In this video, I want to show you my 2025 color grading workflow in DaVinci Resolve. And it is a little bit early to make this because we're at the end of 2024, but I don't expect this to change much as this is what I've been doing for the last 2 to 3 months. And I pretty much like how I'm doing it now. It's all about simplicity and getting a good looking image without much effort. But before we get into it, I want to show you how I expose and make sure that I have the settings correct in my camera, because that's going to make a difference or an impact on how I color grade. So for that to make sense, let's just quickly go through it. I have my iPad here where I'm using the monitor and control app for controlling my ZV-1, and I'm going to screen record the camera now as well. Screen record the iPad, I mean. And that's just going to allow me to show you what I do with the settings. The first thing I'm going to do is turn on ZBrush. So up here in Tools, I have ZBrush 2. It's set to 94%. That's the clipping point for S-Log3, which I always shoot in. So we can turn that on. And with that, we should be able to see if there are anything in the scene that is clipping. And there is not, so it's not a very good example. But if I go up here and we just take off the ND filter for a second here, now you'll be able to see that there are ZBrush everywhere. And we don't want any of these ZBrush in the scene. So let's just put this on again. This is on the lowest setting already, so there's not really much I can do with it. But that's the first thing I check, and check mark for that. We don't have anything clipping in the scene, so that's good. But otherwise, I would change either the ND filter or the aperture to make sure that nothing is clipping in the scene. That's important because we can't bring that down. It's going to look weird because there's no detail left in it. The only other time I will change that is if I need to prioritize the skin tone. So say we're in a dark room and there's a window, bright window in the corner, or there are some bulbs, light bulbs, where we don't need to see any detail in anyway. Then I can go in here and I can change the zebra to zebra 1 and then down to 52%. And then aim for the brightest part of my skin tones. And if you can see on the clip now, we are right around that anyway. Now, important to say here, if we go back to ZBrush 2, sometimes my camera will be blinking at overexposure 2.0. That's completely fine. As long as I'm not clipping my highlights, that's no problem at all, at least for me. That'll make sense when we get into the color grading workflow in a second as well. So the second thing that I do is that I turn on my look. This could be gamma assists. This could be a normal Rec 709 conversion from S-Log3 to Rec 709. Or in my case, I'm using my signature a lot. And you can see now the whole background is in ZBrush, so we can just turn the ZBrush off. This is because we're viewing it in Rec 709 and not in log. The log footage will still not have any ZBrush, so if we turn it back to log, you'll be able to see no ZBrush, so we're all good. So normally I will turn the ZBrush off, go into this, and it looks a little bit overexposed. That's perfectly fine. And then I will go into my white balance here, and I'll just make sure that everything looks good here. Maybe we should be at 6,500 Kelvin because right now in the mountains, I'm basically standing in a cloud. It's also raining a little bit, so it's quite a cool scene. I'm just gonna try to get as close as possible to the right white balance as I can. It mostly makes a difference when I move from outside to inside or the other way around, where it might be very warm lighting inside, so I need to change it down to like 3,200 Kelvin, and it might be very bright or very cool outside, so I need to change it up again. So that's kind of how I manage the settings. And that's pretty much it. So shooting as overexposed as I possibly can, unless I need to prioritize the skin tones, and make sure that I have the right white balance. And of course, I try to stay at ISO 800 and double my frame rate for shutter speed, so the 180-degree rule. And other than that, I just shoot 30 frames per second, and then I adjust the ND and the aperture to accommodate that. So with that said, let's jump into DaVinci Resolve and let me show you exactly how I color grade. First with this shot, so let's just grab a quick scene. Like that. And then I'm going to show you a range of clips that you can actually get in the Mundane Filmmaking Kit that I'll link down below. We'll get more into that in a second, but I'll show you my workflow, how it works when I'm grading a lot of clips. That's a question that I get a lot. So let's head into DaVinci Resolve and have a look at it. Okay, we are inside of DaVinci Resolve, and as you can see, I've just added the intro clip, the little awkward sequence that we just did in 5 seconds, and I also have a bunch of other clips. All of these are included in the Mundane Filmmaking Kit, where the LUTs that I'm going to be using in this tutorial also are in. So these are what I use, and these are my own clips. So you can get those, you can grade along, or you can practice yourself. And we're going to use these to show you how I would normally just color grade, where I'm just thinking out loud. But before we get to that, let's just use this shot or this quick little intro clip that we just did, now that you know how I did my settings. So if we jump into the color grading page here, first of all, let's just touch upon the color management here. I leave basically everything as default in terms of color signs. I think YRGB are just the normal standard one. And then I have changed my timeline color space and my output color space, but I do manage it in the nodes anyway, so I don't think it really makes a difference having it in here. Maybe some of the tools work better. As I mostly shoot S-Log3, that's what I've changed it to. And I don't really use DaVinci Wide Gamut and Intermediate anymore as I used to, because it's just an extra step that I don't feel like I need for what I do. Let's build the node tree quickly. I'm gonna explain to you what I do. And what we need is 5 nodes. So the last one here is gonna be our conversion. Then we have our look, we have contrast, we have balance, color balance, and we have exposure. So these are the 5 nodes that I always work with. In some instances, I'll add a couple more if I need to adjust some hues and stuff. But for 99% of what I do, this is what I use. And all the previous videos that you've seen on my channel for the last few months has been used with this exact workflow. So what we need to change here is in the exposure, I'm going to the HDR wheels. That's what I use to change my exposure in these 3 dots. And then in color space, I change it to Sony S-Gamut3.Cine. You can't see that because it's out of my screen recording, but you just have to trust me. And on gamma, you can just barely see that, S-Log3. So that just makes it so that this tool in itself works as it's supposed to with the log footage that you're actually adjusting. And in the balance here, we are going to the primaries. We're going to set Lume Mix to 0, and we are going to change gamma to linear. There's a very good explanation for this. I think it's the technically best way to change color balance. In your color grading, Colin Kelly made a video on this. That's what I watched. That's when I started doing this. So I'll try to remember and link that in the description below, but otherwise search for Colin Kelly and try and see if you can find that video. It is not a game changer, but it's definitely the easiest way and the best way that I've found, that I've seen to do it. So that's why I'm doing it too. So this is our node tree. The only thing that I will change or adjust before we save it is the conversion. So you can either just use a color space transform, as we've done many times in the past, or I usually just get lazy, so I'll use one of the LUTs that are included in my kit, and that is just this gamut S-Gamut3 to Rec 709. It does the exact same thing as if we reset this and use a color space transform, put that on here, say S-Log3 and dip Rec 709, gamma 2.4. It's the exact same, like it's the exact same conversion. I've made this conversion LUT myself from these settings, so it makes no difference at all. Why you might want to choose this is if you have a lot of different footage, if you're using DaVinci Wide Gamut and Intermediate workflow, if you want to change the tone mapping and all that. I leave that as default. So I'm just going to switch it back to my LUT because I'm lazy. So that's what I'm using, and that just makes it a lot faster. So in gallery here, I already have some power grades, but for the sake of the tutorial, let's just save this one, right click, grab still, call it tutorial, S-Log3. Now we have this saved, so we can apply it to other clips in the future. Let's close these a little bit so we have some more real estate. Click 9 to resize it. That's my shortcut for that. And then we are just going to move this down a little bit. I use Shift Command W to pull up my scopes. I think you can do it in Workspace, Video Scopes, on, and then I have set it to 2 up. I just have my waveform and my vector scope. If you want to see the settings, you can pause it on these screens, and this is just what I've set up. So this is how I've gotten it to the percentage and how I've set it up here. And I have display qualify focus on. It's going to be important in a second. And the vector scope is just set up with this. Basically just a skin tone line and colorize. So it differs a little bit. Sometimes I add the LUT first, you'll see that later, and sometimes I do the color correction first. It kind of depends a little bit. But for the good explanation's sake, we're going to start with the color correction here first, and then add a LUT later. So we have our conversion. That has to be at the end for my workflow, because I want to grade everything in log. Essentially, if we turn this off, this is what all of these nodes see. It starts from here. That's where the log footage comes in. Exposure adjustments we will do on the log footage. And how I like to think about it is that I'm actually adjusting what the camera saw and then converting it into Rec 709 to get the most flexibility, the most amount of information to work with. Whereas if you were to convert it first and then grade on the other side, this is a much smaller color space. You're losing out on all that extra detail and information that you had in the colors if you are grading after the color space. Sometimes some effects and stuff can be after the color space. That's what I normally or sometimes do. But most of what all of I do is this, and that happens before it. But we want this active and we want it at the end, because here is what we see. This is this little output dot, and this is what we see. So everything feeds into this, and then this is where we grade. I hope that made sense. Otherwise, there are other videos that explains that as well. We'll start with exposure, and as we have just changed and mapped our color space in gamma, we are good to go. And because I shot so overexposed, you can really see that now, we're going to bring it down. And rule of thumb is to get the brightest part of the skin tones to lie around 70. If we bring that down to around 70, I think we are here now we're a little bit below, it still looks a bit off, and that's probably because it's much brighter in the background than it was on me. So this is a good rule of thumb. It's not really something that I follow anymore, but I've been grading a lot. So if you need a rule of thumb, that's a good one to start with. I'm going to go a lot more underexposed than this, or like pull it down a lot more. I think this looks a lot more natural already. So minus 1.5 stops, and that's not uncommon for me. Like minus 1, minus 2 stops, somewhere in between that. Because I shoot so overexposed, that's often how I will end up grading or correcting the exposure. And you can see it still looks perfectly fine because we did not clip anything back here. It still looks great. Now we get to the balance, and if we jump into the color wheels here, we'll use the gain because we've changed it to gamma linear. Now we can use the gain to move the blob here around, which is basically just adjusting the color balance. And we've set luminance mix to 0 because we have in the gain luminance red, green, and blue. So we don't want the luminance to be affected while we're doing this. Again, Colin Kelly's video if you really want this explained. But what I'm essentially doing here is I'm looking at the scene. We have some black. We have something that's supposed to be white, my shirt in here, and this sweater is also somewhat supposed to be white. And then we have my skin tones here. So the skin tone line is here. We want the skin tones to lie somewhere around that. And normally if it's well balanced, we have whites and blacks lying in the center here, around the center, because that's where there's 0 saturation. So that's where those are supposed to lie. So let's use that as a starting point. Let's take our sweater here. You can see that lies a little bit more up here. So let's try and pull it down towards the more cyan tones here. So I'm just pulling that down. You can see the blob up here is moving accordingly. I'm going to look at the footage, and I'm going to look up there. I'm going to move my display qualifier up here again, move it a little bit more down, making sure that my skin tones, which is sitting up here, are still lying in the same spot. Maybe we need to put that a little bit more to the left. And I think the blacks here looks like they're a little bit more teal now, but that's okay. And the sweater is also okay. So 6500 Kelvin that we shot this in was a little bit too warm or too cool for this. So now we pulled it back a little bit. I think that already looks a lot better. If we turn this off and then on again, you can really see the difference. And that is why we want to have multiple nodes, because if you want to make a change here, apart from the setting adjustments that we did, like the gamma, if you did all of that in one node, that's difficult to balance and that wouldn't work properly. But also because now I can turn this off and on, and I know exactly what I did in this node was the gain. If I had these two together, I wouldn't know if the exposure messed something up or if it was balanced and so on. Bet you get it now. So now we have contrast, and this is part of the color correction step, but I actually like to add my LUT first in this case, because my LUTs also add a little bit of contrast. So if you go into LUTs, cinematic LUTs, look apart from the V2, that was something I tried to adjust. I actually like cinema as it is a lot more. So let's just add that one on. And so you can see, if we close this again, it adds quite a lot of, not a lot, but it adds some contrast and it tweaks some of the colors a little bit. Basically, cinema just makes it a little bit more teal and orange, but without doing too much. It tweaks the greens a little bit and overall just balances it a little bit more in a cinematic way. This is the LUT that I use on 90-ish% of my footage, I would say. I still think it looks a little bit too flat. So we'll go into the contrast here. I use the tone curve. I'll make a point around the shadows, just bring that down a little bit, and then a point somewhere in the highlights, and then bring that up a little bit. Just brings our skin tones up a little bit. You can maybe pull them up a little bit more here, something like this. And I think we align pretty good with the contrast. So this is before and this is after. This is where I would land and I would be happy and satisfied with how it looks. With that said, something that I always get asked when I did the color grading videos and still to this date when people are watching them are all the trolls saying, oh, but you spent 10 minutes color grading one clip. And no. When I'm explaining things like I did now, it takes a lot longer. So what I want to do now is I want to head into another timeline that I have here. Basically, this timeline just have all the 15 shots that you can find in the Mundane Filmmaking Kit, where the LUTs are as well. And it's all these, they are labeled as what they are. So we have some Mini 4 Pro clips that are D-Log-M and all in 4K. And we have some from my ZV-1 in S-Log3, S-Gamut3.Cine, also 4K. And all of them are 3 seconds long. So it's basically just for you to try and color grade and practice your color grading. And right now, in the description below, there is a link with a discount of 40%. That puts it down to 30 euros. And that's a lot of value for both the clips and the LUTs, but also all the guides and the other things that are in there. I'll be adding more clips and more assets as we go along over the next weeks and months. But if you want to grab this at a discount, if the 50 are sold out, then I will make some more in-depth tutorials and include that in there so you can grade along with these clips. I'll explain it a lot more in detail. But what we're going to do now is head back into the color page here. And I'm just going to grade through, not all of them, but some of these clips and just talk out loud as I think, just to show you how long it would take me. Maybe it's taking a little bit longer, but to grade these and what I'm thinking while I'm doing it. So let's go into gallery here. And because this was our S-Log3, we have to tweak it a little bit. So because this is a drone footage instead, we're first going to take another conversion LUT. There's one for DJI here. It doesn't matter if it's D-Log or D-Log-M. I use the same one. You can see that already helped a lot. And then in our exposure tool here, we just have to map that to D-Log or D-Gamut and D-Log instead. So if we go in here and we grab a still and we say tutorial D-Log, then now we have this one that we can use. So if we went into another clip here and apply grade, then we have that, and that works perfectly fine. But actually one thing that we're going to do for that is add the LUT, because that's how I often grade. So I'll use the Cinema LUT, not on this node, on this node, Cinema LUT here, and then I kind of just see what I want the end result to look like, and then I adjust the exposure and the balance and potentially the contrast according to that. So what I'll do from here is I'll click on this clip, Command C, and then choose all the drone clips, Command V, and now we just have that applied to all of them with the look and with the conversion LUT. And if we go in here to our S-Log clips, we can just apply our grade from earlier, go into look, add our Cinema LUT here, and copy and paste them to all these. So this is our starting point. This is how I would just get a starting point for everything. And now I'm just going to think out loud while I'm grading most of these clips. So let's get back to our starting point here, Command Shift W, and here we go. First of this, I think it looks pretty balanced already, so I don't think I'm going to change anything on the exposure. On the balance side of things, I have B set to my color wheels, by the way, just if you were wondering why I changed so fast to this. I think I'm going to pull this to a little bit more to the warmer side, maybe a little bit up, maybe a little bit to the left, just to get more of a warm scene. I feel like it was a little bit too much to the vector, to the cool side on the vector scope here. I think that looks pretty good. Don't think I'm going to change anything on the contrast. If I do, it's going to be very, very slight adjustments because I don't want to lose too much detail down here. But we could just pull it up a little bit just to give it a little bit more of that power. I think that looks pretty good. For this one, I can pull the exposure down a little bit for this one, I think. So maybe half a stop, something like this. On the balance side of things, let's just see, maybe make it a little bit warmer. Maybe even cooler. I think cooler actually looks good. Just playing around with the gain here, seeing what looks better. I think pulling it down a little bit, down and to the right, tiny bit, looks pretty good. Contrast wise, I think we're sitting in a pretty good place with this shot, so I'm just going to leave that alone. This one here, let's just pull down the exposure a bit, maybe 75, something like this. Yeah. The balance here is definitely off. This was a sunset scene, so let's just pull this up a little bit. Not too much, we don't want it to be all red. And then we could just change the LUT here to golden hour instead. Let's just kind of warm it up a little bit more. Looks a bit better. Maybe tweak the balance a tiny bit more. I think that looks pretty good. And contrast wise, I don't think we're going to change anything here. So holding down Option just locks this in. But we can just add a little bit more brightness. I think that looks pretty good. Next clip, not going to do that one. I think we're done with the drone clips for this. Okay, let's start with this one on the S-Log side of things. I think the overall exposure looks good, but maybe half a stop down. is good. Yeah, that just adds a little bit more, gives us a little bit more detail in the highlights here. Balance side of things, I think we're going to make this a little bit more green and warm. Kind of want the tree log here to sit at the black side, or like in the middle, no saturation. And it just adds a little bit more warmth and yellow to this scene. So just pulling it down and up a little, left and up a little bit. Contrast wise, let's see if you want to do something here. Could pull it down a little bit. I don't want this to clip fully, so it's still sitting here. And just add a tiny bit of contrast here. I think that added a little bit, so let's do that. In here we have some skin tones, so that's a good example. So let's just pull this down, I think probably around 1 stop, because it was pretty overexposed. And balance-wise, here we have a little bit more to work with. So we have some black here. It's already lying dead center. And this is a little bit warmer. Skin tones are looking okay, but maybe a little bit too red. So I think we're actually going to pull this down a little bit. And I think now the skin tones are starting to be a slightly better place. And now it also is obvious that the gray here in the background was quite red. So I think this is a cooler scene. It looks better when it's a bit cooler. And now we can see that was too much red. And we're just going to add a bit more contrast here to make it pop even more. So something like this. Pull out, really give it a bit more crunch with the highlights here. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, next up, this one is boring. This one is a pretty cool scene. So we could just go in here and make it a little bit darker, because I don't want it to be too bright. It's kind of a moody scene. And here, let's just try and aim for the gray here being in the right position. So a little bit more to the cooler side. So it's more neutral, the gray. I think that looks good. And we could add some more contrast here just to make it a little bit darker. Make the sky and the train pop a little bit more here. That looks good. And maybe play around with a few of the other lots. Muted could look good here, but it may be a bit too muted, and nostalgic could make it kind of a fun scene as well. But I think cinema is probably the best one for this still. So let's keep it at that. There's one we're not going to do. This one is a fun one. Let's do this one. Back to exposure, probably around 7.5 here. I think that's pretty good. Balance-wise, I want the water to be a little bit cooler. Just going to pull that down towards the cyan a little bit. That is good, maybe a little bit more. Kind of like when the waterfall has a little bit more of a cooler tone. Contrast-wise here, we're going to pull that down quite a lot. I don't want anything to clip, but we really want that waterfall to stand out. Pulling that up, getting that to around 80 to 90 RE is good, and I think that looks really good actually. Okay, this one we can also do. This one is a bit more of a tricky one usually, so let's just do this one. Pull down the highlights, maybe 1 stop down here, and the balance is always completely off in this one. So let's take the leg here. Definitely needs to go a bit more to the left and maybe a little bit more down. Still a bit too warm, so let's pull it more over. Something like this I think is good. Now it's a bit more neutral. The sweater also stands out a little bit less. And contrast wise, maybe we can just add a bit more crunch to it here. Something like this. I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, that was a big improvement from before to after. We are clipping this a little bit now, but that's okay. It's not really important detail. And this is a boring shot. This one we can do. So let's just pull down the exposure by 1 stop here. This one is way too warm, so we definitely want to cool that down a little bit here. Something like this, I think looks good. And here we want to crunch in the contrast a little bit. So pull down the greens here and then play around with how much we want to pull this up. This looks pretty good. This is one of the few instances where I will make an extra note to adjust the hue and then go into my hue here. And I basically just want to grab all my green tones a little bit more to the side here and then just pull those down because I want them to be a lot more desaturated than the lot did. I think that helped a lot. I think that's pretty good. And let's do a last one from Milford Sound here. So let's just go down. I think 75 is pretty good. Make this a little bit warmer, sitting much to the cooler side. That's good. And then add some contrast. Back to the zone curve. And we don't want to pull it too far down, but I do want the waterfall to stand out again here. So we're just going to pull this up. Play around with where we do that. And I think that looks pretty decent. There's something off with the color balance still, so pull this in here a little bit. The waterfall looked too magenta. I think that's pretty good. Maybe even adjust the contrast even more. Pull this down, pull this up a little bit. I think that looks pretty good. So this was before, this is after, this is without the lot, this is with the lot. And here you can really see how the greens are adjusted to be less artificial, as I like to call it, when they look like this, and a lot more moody, and I like this green a lot more than the other one. I hope that was helpful in one way or another. At least that's how I color grade now. I know there's a lot of things going into it. I tried to explain as much as possible in this video, and I know it was a little bit long. Again, if you want to grab the Mundane Filmmaking Kit, there are the lots that I used and all the clips that you can grade with as well. And with the discount code below, or like the link with the discount below, if 50 of you grab this bundle at the 30 euros that it gets down to, which is a very good deal, I think, I will make some more in-depth tutorial and include it in there so you can grade along. My color grading course is no longer for sale, so this is the best way to support my channel, but also get some cool assets that you can use. I'll be adding more clips, and a way that you can get some tutorials that you can just download the video and grade along next to it if you want that. So I hope some of you want to grab that. I really love these LUTs that I'm using now, and this workflow has really made it fast and easy for me to just grade and make my videos, and taking a lot of the friction off of making and grading and just creating in general. So I hope that you liked this video. Leave a like and a comment below if you did. And other than that, I'll just catch you in the next one. And until then, take care.